Come, Sirrah Jack-ho, fill some tobacco, bring a wire and some fire. Haste, haste away, quick, do not stay delay, for I drank none good today. Come, Sirrah Jack-ho, fill some tobacco, bring a wire and some fire. Haste, haste away, quick, do not stay delay, for I drank none good today.
So let me tell you the words to this. This is a madrigal by Thomas Weelkes, which is when tobacco was first introduced to Europe. And the words are, come, Sirrah Jack-ho, fill some tobacco. Bring a wire, that's, to light it up, and some fire. Haste away, quick, I say. Do not stay, shun delay, for I drank none good today. They didn't have a word yet for smoking, so they said they would drink tobacco. They weren't actually drinking it, they were smoking, but they didn't have a word for that. And then with the verse that we just heard is, I swear that this tobacco is perfect Trinidado, which means it comes from Trinidad, the best there is. By the very mass never was better gear than is here, by the rood for the blood and rood rhyme in Elizabethan English. It is very good. Now, you may wonder why they're saying it's good for the blood. By the rood means you're swearing by the cross. And he says, fill the pipe once more, my brains dance trench more. It is heady, I am giddy, my head and brains, back and reins, my back and my kidneys, joints and veins, from all pains, it doth well purge and make clean. So he's exclaiming the medicinal virtues of tobacco, saying this is going to make him very healthy because he's smoking. It purges the superfluous humors like the cold in my nose. This would be great medicine for it in the 16th and 17th century. Let me read the last verse. Then those that do condemn it, or such as not commend it, never were so wise to learn good tobacco to discern. Let them go pluck a crow, and do not know, as I do, the sweet of Trinidado. So the people in England at the time were getting their tobacco from Trinidad. That would very soon change when most of it would come from Virginia, just a couple of years after this is written. So let's talk about the tobacco, one of the New World plants discovered by Europeans in the 16th century. Of course, Native Americans have been using it for ages. And in their sort of mad rush to find medicinal plants from which they could profit, among these was tobacco, which was everywhere, of course, where they first landed in Virginia and North Carolina. It's a strange kind of plant. It is in the Solanaceae family, so what you would not expect is that it's a relative of tomatoes and potatoes. Those are Solanaceae. And you could recognize it because there's a little white trumpet-shaped flower, which all of these the plants in this genera share. There are two different species. There's Nicotiana rustica and Nicotiana tabacum. And the leaves of this are normally dried, not out in the sun though, in a place that's humid, so they actually are cured. They go through a kind of fermentation. Sometimes they're flavored thereafter with rum is actually fine. Whiskey you could flavor them with, or other perfumes. And then they're shredded and can be taken in any number of ways. They can be smoked in a pipe like this. That's the first most usual way, and this is a very typical pipe of that era. You could roll them into cigars or later roll them in paper cigarettes. Those come in the 19th century. And then there's also a couple of other odd forms of tobacco and the way it's taken. It can be chewed in a form which is called plug, which is like Red Man, it's shredded up leaves that you just chew on. Or snuff, which is can be actually two different things. It could be very finely chopped and moist, which is what you see people put in their lip and just leave there. That's Copenhagen. I'm not sure where and how the Scandinavians started doing that, which is a kind of mystery to me. But of course, they're all named. That kind of chewing tobacco is named for Scandinavian countries and words. But snuff also means something else. Let me actually show you a bit of it. Snuff also. So these are two different things. This is snuff that's the wet, moist stuff. There's actually nothing in here. But this stuff is snuff that's a powdered form. And the way it would be done is you'd take this little powder take a very fine pinch of it, stuff it up your nose, and snort it. And it gives you this is something I can't actually do in my office. It gives you this amazing head rush. And if you're good at it, you won't sneeze. I probably am going to sneeze now that I think about it. I just took some. Okay, so the active compound, which you know is called nicotine, is named for an actual person named Jean Nicot. And he was an active promoter of this in the 17th century, so he gets the whole drug named after him. Yay for nicotine. Wouldn't that be fun to have something like that named after you? The question that I think is kind of interesting is whether tobacco really should be classified as a controlled substance. Is it addictive? So lots of people say, yes, of course it is. I don't know whether it is or not. And even whether it should be legal at all is a matter for debate. But there is no doubt and no denying that tobacco is one of the most widely used drugs on the planet. And yes, it's a drug because it does affect your central nervous system. It affects your mood and your brain. And I'm wired right now, actually, from that little snort. And it is used by about 1 billion people, or that's a third of the adult population of the earth, use some form of tobacco. Caffeine and nicotine are the world's first and third most widely consumed psychoactive substances on the planet. And I'm sure you can guess number 2. Yeah, it's alcohol. So although the use of tobacco has been dropping in the developed world, what may surprise you is overall consumption has still been steadily rising globally. So in much of the world that didn't have tobacco before, they're getting it cheaply made now. And I do refer to it as a drug because, in fact, nicotine in large doses is hallucinogenic. It really will change you, and it's also one of the very few drugs commonly used with scientifically verified negative health results. The connection between tobacco use and pulmonary and heart disease and emphysema and cancer if you smoke it, those are proven. So this is not, unlike most other drugs that may have some side effects or something, these definitely have negative long-term impacts on health that we know about, and of course the industry lied about for a very long time. But let's get back to the beginning of the history of tobacco, because it's really a fascinating plant. The cultivation in the New World, I mean domestication, goes back at least several thousand years, and the Aztecs, as is the case with most Native Americans, ritually used tobacco. They smoked it, they chewed it, they used it as an entheogen. In other words, taking in the god. And Native North Americans in North America smoked it in a kind of pipe, what we would call it a peace pipe. Of course, that's not what they call it, but it was used to seal bargains, to go into a trance state. They would use this, and they carried on. There was an extensive trade in tobacco across North America, which was one of the most widely cultivated plants used in commerce. What is kind of interesting and maybe fascinating, I think, is that it was not really used recreationally. People didn't smoke it on their own just to take a break and have fun or enjoy it. It was mostly used for divination. And actually, I attended a ceremony around near Toronto that was actually on an ancient burial ground. And I was kind of surprised that the whole ceremony centered around an offering of tobacco to the gods, to the ancestors, I should say, and it was still done today. Someone came with a little pouch of tobacco like this, and then gave us all a little bit, and we said a prayer and offered it, and it was really, really pretty amazing. But of course, when Europeans encountered Native Americans using this, they were sort of suspect. So John Gerard says this about tobacco. He's a 16th century botanist. The priests and enchanters do take the fume thereof until they be drunk. And after that they have lain for dead 3 or 4 hours, they may tell the people what wonders, visions, or illusions they have seen, and so 5 them a prophetical direction or foretelling, if we may trust the devil. So he's, clearly repeating that this is something, that these are not real gods that they're praying to, that they're somehow demonic. But he thinks that the tobacco is actually inducing the hallucinogenic state. Monards is another one. He's a botanist in Seville, he's Spanish, who also is the first to kind of report on all these New World plants. And we'll come back to him in just a moment, but he says this about Native American usage. And keep in mind also, he hadn't gone there. This is second or third hand, and he's reporting in a way that's colored by the insistence that this form of divination is demonic. But it nonetheless points, I think, even indirectly to how it was used before European contact. I think it's, we don't have accounts historically, so this is sort of a little clue of what might have been done. So I'll read you the whole passage. It's kind of fascinating. One of the marvels of this herb, and that which does bring most admiration, is the manner how the priests of the Indies did use it, which they did in this manner. When there was amongst the Indians any manner of business or great importance, in the which the chief gentleman called cacique, we still use that word, cacique, or any of the principal people of the country, having necessity to consult with their priests, in any business of importance, then they went and propounded their matter to the chief priest. Forthwith, in their presence, he took certain leaves of tobacco, and cast them into the fire, and did receive the smoke of them at his mouth and at his nose with a cane. So he's got a long tube. And in taking of it, he fell down upon the ground as a dead man, and remaining so, according to the quantity of the smoke he had taken. And when the herb had done his work, he did revive and awake, and gave them answers according to the visions and illusions which he saw. Whiles he was wrapped of the same manner, he did interpret to them, as to him seemed best, or as the devil had counseled him, giving them continually doubtful answers, in such sort that however it fell out, they might say that it was the same, which was declared, and the answer that they made. In like sort, the rest of the Indians for their pastime do take the smoke of tobacco. So he's saying it is recreational, for them to make themselves drunk withal, and see the visions and things that do represent to them, wherein they do delight. And other times they took it to know their business and success, because conformable to that which they had seen being drunk therewith, even so they might judge of their business. So they're doing it to compact deals and make trades and peace and, well, who knows, whatever. And as the devil is a deceiver, and has the knowledge of virtue of herbs, he did show them the virtue of this herb, that by means thereof they might see their imaginations and visions, and he has represented to them, and by that means he does deceive them. Okay, so again, these are Europeans very leery of the idea of smoking tobacco as a dangerous thing that's somehow connected to their worship of demonic gods. The Indians also chewed tobacco to stave off hunger, and as you might know if you've ever tried it, it does actually suppress your appetite. And the Indians use the tobacco to, I'll read this, to suffer the dryness, and also for to suffer hunger, and to pass days without having need to eat or drink. But when they shall travel by any desert, meaning an empty place, or dispeopled country where they shall find neither water nor meat, meaning just any old food at all they can't find, they do use of these little balls which they make of this tobacco, and they take the leaves of it and do chew it. And as they go chewing of them, they go mingling with them certain powder made of the shells of cockles burned. So this is a lime that they're using that kind of activates. And they go mingling it in the mouth all together until they make it to like a dough, of which they make certain little balls, little greater than peason, that's a pea that they're talking about, and they put to dry in the shadow, and after they keep them, they use them in this form following. Then they use to travail by ways where they find no water nor meat, and they take these balls of these, they put in between the lower lip and the teeth, and they go chewing it all the time they do travel, and that which they do chew, they do swallow it down. And in this sort they do journey 3 or 4 days without having need of meat, without any food or drink. For they feel no hunger, dryness, nor weakness, nor travel to trouble them. And I do think that to journey after this sort is the cause they go chewing continually these little balls. So there is still actually a form of tobacco like that. It's a little roll ball of snus, which is what they do in Scandinavia. So chewing tobacco goes back much further and does smoking tobacco. As for the Europeans, Columbus, believe it or not, was the first person to report having seen the act of smoking. This is on the island of San Salvador. This happens in 1492. Columbus was presented with a few leaves, and he did not know what they were for. He threw them away, which is kind of surprising because Columbus was looking desperately for any kind of medicinal herb he could bring back to Europe and impress the Queen. But one crew member did not throw it away. This is Rodrigo de Jerez, and he apparently tried smoking and took to it very, very quickly. And he is recognized as the first European smoker. And he apparently used to do tricks and blow smoke out of his mouth. And Europeans were terrified. Remember, they've never seen smoking of anything before, right? This is something completely, utterly foreign to their way of thinking and their understanding. So to blow smoke out of your mouth is like, oh my God, what's going on? So this is on the island that is today Cuba. This is an account of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a great defender of the Indians. But he says this: men with half-burned wood in their hands and certain herbs to take their smokes, which are some dry herbs put in a certain leaf also dry, like those boys make on the day of Passover of the Holy Ghost. And having lighted one part of it, by the other they suck, absorb, or receive that smoke inside their breath. And they don't have pipes like this, they have long tubes that they're sucking in the smoke, by which they become benumbed and almost drunk, so that it is said that they do not feel fatigue. And these muskets, as we will call them, they're long and, tubes, they call tobaccos. So the tube itself is called that. I knew Spaniards on this island of Hispaniola who were accustomed to take it, and being reprimanded from it by telling them it was a vice, they replied they were unable to cease using it. So signs of addiction, even there. And I do not know what relish or benefit they found in it. Nonetheless, the Spanish said, well, let's see if it sells. Let's see if this thing that Native Americans are using, we can foist somehow onto Europeans who know nothing about smoking. They've never done it, okay? So the word tobacco, again, refers to the tube to start. It's not the plant. In native languages, the word is petum, betum, kogioba in Arawak, I think, yahuetl, pisiget, sietl, yetl. Those are the Nahuatl languages. And eventually they did find out what tobacco was used for by the natives. In other words, they were finally investigating. So 1529, this takes them quite a long time, Bernardino de Sahagun, Sahagun, he's an ethnographer basically, reported that the Aztec medicinal uses include breathing in the fresh green leaves to cure headaches, and for colds, the leaves were powdered and rubbed inside the mouth, which would, he said, was very good for, he said they did this for a cold. And again, our friend Nicholas Monards, that's spelled just as it sounds, in a translation that was made by the Englishman Frampton in 1576, Monard said, I'm going to sell this stuff. I'm going to promote it. He was the great promoter of New World plants, and he basically has 101 uses for this new drug, okay? I'll read you a little bit of him because he's also equally fascinating. This herb tobacco has a particular virtue to heal griefs of the head, and in a special coming of cold causes, and so it cures the headache when it comes of a cold humor, or of a windy cause. The leaves must be put hot into it upon the grief, and multiplying them until the time that is needed, until the grief be taken away. So you have a sore, you put on a plaster of tobacco, which works actually. Some there be that do anoint them with the oil of oranges, and it does a very good work. In any manner of grief that's in the body or part thereof, it helps. Being of a cold cause and applied thereto, it takes it away, not without great admiration. Saying this is wonderful drug that we don't know anything about. In griefs of the breast, it does make a marvelous effect, and especially those that do cast out matter and rottenness of the mouth, and in them that are short-breathed. It seems very odd. Okay, you have a shorter breath, smoke. And any other evils making of the herb a seething, and with sugar and a syrup being taken in little quantities. So they're actually making a kind of a syrup out of the tobacco. It does cause to expel matters and rottenness of breath marvelously, and the smoke being taken at the mouth does cause the matter to be put out of the breast, them that do it. So smoking is going to help you cough up phlegm and stuff like that. In the grief of the stomach, caused of cold causes or wince, the leaves being put in very hot, it does take it away, and dissolves it by multiplying of them until it be taken away. And it is to be noted that the leaves are to be warmed better than any other amongst ashes or embers of very hot, thrusting the herbs in them, and so to warm them well, and although they be put to some ashes, it makes them work better and of stronger effect. So in other words, you're heating the leaves and you're pressing it on your stomach or your chest or something. Okay? In opulations of the stomach, this is when you have clogs inside your stomach and the inner parts principally, this herb is a great remedy, for it does dissolve them, consumes them, and in this same manner it does other manner of opulations or hardness that is in the belly, causing the the cause being of a cold humor or of windiness. So the first promotion of tobacco, surprisingly enough, is as medicine for cold disorders. It's a hot herb. Okay, remember that whole humoral system? This is what's going on. So the botanists start publishing images of this. The first is in Nicotiana Tabacum in Pena and de Lobel's 1570 Stirpium Adversana Nova, which is also shows this very fanciful guy smoking this enormous bong-like thing. I don't know, it's a big tube of tobacco that he's smoking, what looks like about 20 pounds of it. And at the time, Jean Nicot, our friend Nicot, ambassador to the King of Portugal, was the first to get some of this stuff in Portugal and send it to France in 1560. And he tells of a cook in his household who was accidentally making dinner, and he cut his hand with a big chopping knife, and a steward made the poultice out of tobacco, wound it around the wound, and he was miraculously cured in a few days. So there are all sorts of stories of the miraculous cures of tobacco in curing ulcers and curing scrofula, and all sorts of people who were cured at the court of Francis II. This is the middle of the second century. Francis II, a very brief reign. He was actually married to Mary Queen of Scots, if you've seen the Tudors, which is a terrible series. But in any case, he's in that. So the English actually first encounter it in Trinidad. And as I mentioned, they don't have a word for smoking, so they call taking tobacco drinking. Okay, I know that sounds confusing, but they didn't drink it. Sir Walter Raleigh is the guy, of course, credited with having popularized it at court, and after a couple of voyages he sponsored personally to Roanoke in the 1580s, he said of tobacco that the leaves thereof being dried and brought into a powder, they used to take the fume or smoke thereof by sucking it through pipes made of clay into their stomach and head. No, it doesn't go into your head, actually it goes down into your lungs. It doesn't go into your stomach either, but you can understand, he doesn't really understand what's going on. And from whence it purgeth superfluous phlegm and other gross humors, and preserves them in health. And so in other words, he's saying they're healthy because they smoke. And he's actually writing about clay pipes. The clay pipes are actually a European innovation. He's wrong about that. But normally what they would do is roll the leaves up, kind of like a cigar, or they put it in a big wooden pipe, or they'd have a carved stone bowl they would light on fire and breathe directly out of it. So tobacco, strangely enough, really caught on. It's like the hot new thing to do in late 16th century England. Anthony Schute's Tobacco of 1595 says the distinct and several opinions of the late and best physicians that have written on the diverse natures and qualities thereof. And Shute insists in the preface to this book that it hath cleared the sight in a night of great commandment and worship, and cured a gentleman that long languished of consumption. This is tuberculosis, and he says the tobacco cured him. Who hath ever found a more sovereign remedy in coughs, rheum, and the stomach, and eyes and heads, from which it will fetch the humor in so strange a quantity as in some is admirable? He also says that it was, he has it used when journeying to, if you go on a long journey, it'll keep you away and fend off weariness. And he says after 6 or 7 pipes, it then causes a profound sleep. I think man hath not known an excellenter preserver against the late dangerous infection than this. And he is absolutely right about that. Strangely enough, in small doses, nicotine stimulates the nervous system. But if you take a large dose of it, I guess 6 or 7 pipes full, it acts as a depressant. So it does actually knock you out if you take enough of it, weirdly enough. So the herbals that describe tobacco, and let's go back to John Gerard. It's spelled Gerard. It's actually still in print. You can find copies of it even online if you want. This is 1597, and he has an entry for tobacco which describes it botanically. He says, here's how it grows, here are its virtues. It's a very good remedy against the migraine, remedy for toothache, teeth, and gums. If you rub a linen cloth soaked in tobacco juice, you rub it on your teeth, you'll feel better. And then a round ball of the leaves placed in the mouth is also good. It's good against poison. And if you drink the juice of tobacco, and it will prevent wounds from venomous beasts if you wash with it. So they're experimenting with ways to get it into your body. And in this case, he does say you're actually making a tincture of it, like a tea. Okay? But he's also skeptical about the value of smoking. He says that, to remove pains in the head and body and chest, the leaves may be a palliative, or they may ease the symptoms for a while, but he says they don't actually do a cure. They don't do anything long term. And he says this from his own personal experience treating his patients. He says some use to drink it, as it is termed, they're smoking, for wantonness, or rather of custom, and cannot forbear it. No, not in the midst of their dinner, which kind of taking is unwholesome and very dangerous. He's saying that people can't stop, even while they're eating, they're smoking. Although to take it seldom, and that physically, meaning for medicine's sake, is to be tolerated and may do some good, but I commend the syrup above this fume or smoky medicine. So he's saying that if you concoct a syrup out of it and take a very small dose, it's going to work better than smoking. And I think the most interesting passage in Gerard has to do with who uses tobacco as a medicinal drug and how, which is really a fascinating moment in the history of medicine, when folk healers who worked for profit were being hunted down in favor either of home remedies provided as charity, or in fact professional physicians trying to protect their jobs. So let me just read this to you. It's actually kind of fascinating. He says, I send this jewel unto you, women of all sorts, but especially such as cure and help the poor and impotent of your country without reward, meaning folk healers, wise women. We use another word for them today. It's called witches. Okay. He says, but until the beggarly rabble of witches, charmers, and other cousiners that regard more for to get money than to help for charity, I wish these few medicines far from their understanding, and from those deceivers whom I wish to be ignorant in them. So he's saying he doesn't want to give this to local witches because they will start using it and using it for bad. Unless, because they're charging. And so this is in a way weirdly protecting the professional of medicine, but also cutting out those wise women who are doing it for, locally, on their own. But if you're an honest gentlewoman, then of course it's something else. If you're doing it for charity. And he gives a recipe that's made from tobacco leaves, hog's grease, red wine, all boiled together and reduced with a bit of turpentine and aristolochia. And this is, you don't eat that, of course, it'll kill you, but it's a balm to cure wounds. You spread this on your wound and you'll be much better. So the history of the founding of the British colonies in North America is intimately linked to tobacco. And the history of the entire region of Virginia and the Carolinas, you could say right down to the present, is also largely to do with tobacco. That's, they really had no idea what they were going to do when they got there, what kind of industry or business they were going to go into, and tobacco worked. In 1609, when they got there, man, they were trying to make glass. They were doing a lot, and ship it back to England, by the way. And they failed at most of their agricultural pursuits, and it was Not until John Rolfe, you may know him as the husband of Pocahontas. Pocahontas didn't marry John Smith, but with John Rolfe, he tried planting a Bermuda variety of tobacco, and it thrived there, and at least to the English, tasted fine, so they had a commercial crop that worked there. And of course, how they worked this was not with Englishmen, but with African slaves that were brought. As early as 1619, there were African slaves in North America. So, if you're thinking who are the people that arrived first, it's a handful of Englishmen, and within a decade, there are slaves there too. Within a year of importing these slaves, they were producing 119,000 pounds a year. By 1640, they were producing 1.5 million pounds. So did this drug catch on? Was it sold well? Yes, absolutely. And the practice of smoking became so widespread that a person, nonetheless, King James I, published a book called The Counterblast to Tobacco. He hated the habit. He thought it was absolutely vile and disgusting. Let me read you some of his counterblast. It's marvelous invective, and he's such a pompous ass too. But in any case, the manifold abuses of this vile custom of tobacco taking may be the better espied. It is fit that first you enter into a consideration both of the original thereof, meaning the origin, and likewise of the reasons of the first entry thereof into this country, meaning England. For certainly as such customs that have their first institution either from a godly, necessary, or honorable ground, and are such brought in by the means of some worthy, virtuous, and great personage, are ever and most justly holden in great and reverent estimation and account by all wise, virtuous, and temperate spirits. So noble people who bring in great things should be praised because they're virtuous and useful. So it should be, by the contrary, justly bring a great disgrace into that sort of customs which, having their origin from base corruption and barbarity, talking about the Native Americans, of course, do in like sort make their first entry into a country by inconsiderate and childish affectation of novelty. So people started doing this because it's brand new and cool to smoke, as is the case of the first invention of tobacco taking and the first entry thereof among us. So you can see his argument. He's saying that because its origin is among barbarians, it's of course a horrible vice among us civilized people. For tobacco, being a common herb which grows almost everywhere, was first found out by some of the barbarous Indians to be a preservative or an antidote against the pox, a filthy disease whereunto these barbarous people are, as all men know, very subject. They thought they got this pox, syphilis, from the New World. What though the uncleanly and adust constitution of their body, and what through the intemperate heat of their climate, so that as from them was first brought into Christendom that most detestable disease, so from them likewise was brought this tobacco. Saying just like syphilis came from the New World, so did tobacco. As a stinking and unsavory antidote for so corrupted and execrable a malady, the stinking suffumigation whereof they yet use against that disease, making so one canker or venom to eat out another. Now, good countrymen, lest us, I pray you, let us consider what honor or policy can move us to imitate the barbarous and beastly manners of the wild, godless, and slavish Indians, especially in so vile and stinking a custom. Shall we that disdain to imitate the manners of our neighbor France, having the style of the first Christian kingdom, and that cannot endure the spirit of the Spaniards, their king being now comparable in largeness of dominions to the great emperor of Turkey? Shall we, I say, that have been so long civil and wealthy in peace, famous and invincible in war, fortunate in both, we that have been ever able to aid any of our neighbors, but never defeated any of their ears with any of our supplications for assistance, we Englishmen do it on our own, shall we, I say, without blushing, abase ourselves so far as to imitate these beastly Indians? Slaves to the Spaniards, refused to the world, and as yet aliens from the holy covenant of God? Why do we not well imitate them in walking naked as they do? In preferring glasses, feathers, such toys to gold and precious stones as they do? Yea, why do we not deny God and adore the devil as they do? Okay, so some pretty racist arguments, obviously, on the part of James. And he, also in this text thoroughly picks apart the idea that it's hot and dry and good for lung ailments. He says, but rather have a certain venomous faculty joined with the heat thereof, which makes it have an antipathy against nature. So he abhors this odor, obviously, of smoke. Well, let me show you a couple of images. So just so you know, everyone isn't for it. Some people are really against it. Can you see that right there? It's a little ditty of a guy selling his wares of tobacco. Come backy ho, come buy you, blah, 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 blah. But what looks good actually turns out bad. Turn away, please. And the guy is obviously vomiting. He's taken a little too much. But you can see he's got a pipe, just like I've got, and he's got a little light there. You see the pipe is in this hand. The light is a wick, basically. It's burning. And so there were people who definitely looked down upon this. Here's a couple of dudes in a bar with their great hats smoking away. And there is a guy who says that my nose is all blocked up, I fear. It needs a dose of snuff to clear. Okay. I can assure you it didn't work. Okay, so in any case, for every person who is advertising tobacco for medicinal uses, there are also people who are turning against it and saying this is crazy, this is a barbaric custom, and it smells bad and it's not good for your health, and why would anyone start to do this? Within a couple of decades, medical authors also grew skeptical of the medicinal values of tobacco because people had been prescribing it, and they look and say, there's nothing going on here. This is not really a medicine. Well, of course, from empirical evidence, they're finding this out. And my favorite of these, a physician, his name is William Vaughan. Okay, Vaughan. He wrote a book called Directions for Health, and these are his words: "Tobacco, that outlandish weed, doth spend the brain and spoil the seed," meaning it will make you go impotent. "It dulls the sprite, it dims the sight, it robs a woman of her right." So the argument is kind of like that used for coffee, that it's so heating that it's going to dry you out and make you go blind eventually because it's such a hot medicine. And his argument is that, yes, it may have a few medicinal properties, but, and I quote here, "Tobacco, as all other things which God gave us for necessities, are superfluously employed into a bacchanalian beastly custom." In other words, people are doing it for fun while they drink. Bacchanalia is remember the celebration of Bacchus. "To serve toss pots instead of salt meats." In other words, what they would do is you go into a bar and they'd have salted meats, things like corned beef, right, and salted herrings, and those increase your thirst, so you drink more because that's the way they make money. But he's saying they're smoking instead of eating these salty foods. And a toss pot is, of course, someone who tosses the pot back. Instead of salt meats, caviar, and other inducements or drawers on of drink. In other words, the association with drinking is there right from the very start. It's something you do in a pub and you smoke. And of course, it becomes the fashion from this point in the 17th century all the way until 4 or 5 years ago. It was banned in British pubs, so people smoke on the street now. But it used to be inside a pub. It was filled with smoke. That's very, very recently changed. So, in other words, so the association with drinking is there. I'm not sure it really makes you want to drink more like salty food does, but it's become part of the ritual. And if you look at any 17th century Dutch tavern scene or still life, if there's a pipe sitting there with some tobacco spilling out like this, there'll be a roamer or a drinking glass there. Look, for example, at David Tennier's Peasants Smoking in an Inn. That's of 1640. It's a great example of what I'm talking about. So, like so many other products in the course of the 17th century, tobacco also makes a very gradual transition, going from a medicinal to a recreational drug. Presumably, people figured out when it failed to achieve results, or when people just became addicted and then said, I need a regular supply. And there were all sorts of comments we saw that they could not forbear it. They couldn't stop doing it. And of course, those people who are unfortunately addicted to tobacco now make similar claims that, and whether it's a social thing, whether you just get used to having something in your mouth and or taking a break and smoking. I know the addiction is largely psychological, but it's also a drug. It also you become addicted to it chemically also and physiologically, and stopping smoking is many people say is much harder than most drugs. But it starts to come in a regular supply, as I said. And in Spain, the recreational use of tobacco seems to mimic the use in New Spain directly. Back in New Spain is, of course, Mexico, as well as native practice, especially in the fact that it's used in social rituals and gatherings. And let me give you an example of this. This is Juan de Castro e Medinilla. He's a pharmacist from Cordoba in Spain, and he says that tobacco is today in such usage that people of merit enclose a great quantity of tobacco and keep it in aromatic, carefully guarded places, as they do in Spain with good wine. They're putting it in their cellars, and if you maybe you don't know this, is cigars like humid, cool temperatures. So a tobacco cellar serves and a wine cellar are virtually the same. And when it is time to sit down to a meal, they gather 3 or 4 leaves or more, depending on the number of people at table, and taking them with other aromatic ingredients, they twist them into a roll that they call a cigarrillo. A little cigar is what that means. And beginning to eat, take swallows of smoke as we do wine. And it is considered so decorated and customary that its smell is overlooked. In other words, they just got used to the fact that for those who aren't smoking, it smells rather vile. As cigars do. If you're not smoking one yourself and someone else is smoking it, ugh. And he continues this way. If anyone of importance come to visit, they take some and toast with them with tobacco. And such usage is now introduced into our parts that it is not only for toasting, but such that one who is lacking tobacco goes out to request some. And with this, there is a feast. So it's taken on this strange social role that you do it together with your guys. And in England, they would take it in a very small pipe like this and sort of pass it around and go, good shit, man, and it would be of course, it's a drug, right? It's one of the first recreational social drugs that you do in company with other people and to enjoy yourself. So the fashion for various forms of tobacco actually changes over time dramatically. Snuff becomes really popular at the very end of the 17th century, and especially in the 18th century. They want this powdered stuff, which in Scotland you call sneeshing. And there's a very strange ritual of putting it on your hand like this and snorting it up, and like I guess you would cocaine in a way. And men and women would carry these little snuff boxes on them, and whenever they felt a little slagging, they'd take a pinch, and it is an upper. It definitely keeps you alert. It actually makes your brain kind of work very quickly, and so if you're doing something that requires intense concentration, this is going to keep you up, and especially if you're smoking and drinking coffee, and your brain will go a little wacky, and will come to depend on it actually. So the pipes also change. They go from this clay tavern pipe to something called meerschaum, which is it's actually this. It means sea foam, but it's not actually. It's a kind of mined mineral that's very soft and easily carved, and it turns this lovely red color. Well, I have one. I should have brought it here to show you. But in any case, and then eventually wooden pipes replace these. The advantage of wood is it doesn't get hot. The meerschaum and the clay get very hot, which is also why you have normally a very long pipe. Is the hot tobacco in the end will cool by the time it gets to your mouth. So you don't really want it this close, unless the end breaks off, which you find often. And in fact, these things are found in archaeological digs all the time, because people would smoke them, they'd break, and they just toss it away, and they're very cheap, so you just replace it. So of bits of pottery shards and things like that, people find pipe stems, and I've actually got one right over there. I'll break into class. I'll show you one. I picked it up in the Thames. The Thames has a really low water tide. It's a tidal river, and at certain points of the day, you can actually walk along the shores and pick up little bits of clay pottery and things. And I have a pipe stem that looks like a piece of this that could be, it's probably 18th century, which is kind of cool. In any case, there is a very interesting tobacco war, so-called, during the American Revolution, when the British seized tobacco shipments and placed embargoes on U.S. goods. Okay? In the short run, this caused some farmers in the Carolinas to switch to rice. They said, forget it, we're not growing tobacco anymore, or other crops. But it also turned attention of the growers to the domestic market. And during the American Revolution, surprisingly, tobacco consumption rises dramatically. They're not worrying, should we be selling all this to Europe and supplying them? Maybe we could sell it domestically now that the market to the British is cut off. And what is interesting is after the war, the custom switched to cigars, and they were grown. People grew. There was sort of fashion for the tobacco that was grown in the Caribbean, especially Cuba, of course. Wealthier people would smoke these, ancestors to the cigar in the 19th century, and chewing tobacco had a kind of social, not necessarily a stigma yet, but it had an association with rural people. Is if you were in the rural places, you'd put a plug in and you could spit wherever you wanted. And of course, the chewing tobacco, let's say, became very, very fashionable in the 19th century. Lots of people chewed, and of course, if you went into a bar, even in the gold rush era, if you came here, there would be a spittoon in the bar, a big metal pot, and you ding, and you'd and apparently in the late 19th century, by one description, the Senate floor, this is the United States Senate, ran with rivulets of tobacco spittle during sessions. And the way that they did this is also quite unusual. I used to have one sitting around in my office anymore. I don't think I do. It's called a twist. What you do is you take the whole leaf, wrap it in a roll, and then twist it around and turn it and twist it again. So you have this little sort of plug of tobacco, and all you do is you just bite off a piece and put it in your pocket, and it lasts for a long time. And you still find that in the South, very interestingly. A twist tobacco. It's not loose leafed. It's not finely shred. It's just a big wad that you can bite off, and very sweet also. So let me give you a little more of the history. So in 1828, nicotine was isolated by a physician named Wilhelm Heinrich Posselt and the chemist Carl Ludwig Reimann. Nicotine in its pure form is poison. Okay, it's basically a defense mechanism of the plant to keep predators away. Herbivores who would naturally eat the plant taste it. It's really bitter, and that tells them keep away poison, bad for you. If you take it in small quantities, it's a stimulant and perversely a relaxant. It actually stimulates you, but the process actually makes you calmer and more alert. So that's a really kind of unique drug. We haven't talked about anything like that. We've always talked about things that are depressants or stimulants, whatever. This is actually makes you alert but calm. It also suppresses your appetite, as we saw from the early examples. So how the fashion changes is during the Crimean War. The fashion came from the Crimea, is south of Ukraine. It's now part of Russia again. Man, I had an example to show you, and I don't know what to do with it. If anyway, these people who are called Zouaves, okay, are the and you still find their picture on zigzag rolling papers. And that's what I was trying to look for you to find. I might have one in here. Oh, here it is. There's a guy. Okay, he's Zouave. And they were actually fighting Zouaves in the American Civil War. They actually wore these costumes. Their whole troops got up as Turkish men. But in any case, this is a French company of the Zouave. And the fashion came from the Crimea to roll it in paper. 1847, Philip Morris started selling what were called Turkish cigarettes. Another few companies said this is great because then people don't have to carry it around, roll it themselves. What a pain. R.J. Reynolds came in 1875. The American Tobacco Company was founded in 1874. And by 1890, it became the largest company controlling almost the entire industry until it was broken up by an antitrust act in 1911. Um, then in 1881, a cigarette rolling machine was invented by James Bonsack, and taxes on tobacco were lifted for reasons that the government, I guess, wanted to support the industry. This happens all the time, right? They find a valuable crop and they say, well, let's lift the taxes and people will plant more. There were major advertising campaigns of all the national brands, and so smoking became very, very common. When you get to the middle of the 20th century, adults all smoked. It was just very common. Many of the brands that are still around today came out early 20th century. I think Reynolds came out with Camels in the 1913, so they're around. It is very much a 20th century phenomenon. The standard, and they struck on some very brilliant ways to sell it. You sell it in a box that is not going to break with 20 cigarettes in it, and wrap that in foil so it stays fresh. If it goes stale, it's dry and really nasty. And I think the early cigarette ads really are fascinating and sometimes very beautiful. In fact, if you think of the Job cigarette ad, it's for rolling papers, that's done by Alphonse Mucha. If you know, he's a Czech painter who makes his way to Paris and does ads for everything, soap and whatever. But I think one of his most famous images is for Job rolling papers. So so tobacco becomes a kind of fad in the 19th century also. There's another major push to use it for medicinal purposes. They used something, they had smoke enemas, made medicines using tobacco, a whole slew of ailments used tobacco as a cure. And eventually the form changes again by the time we get to the 50s, when they decide to put a filter tip on it. So they have a little kind of originally cork, and that's actually why it looks sort of like cork on the end. It's kind of funny. But they eventually make a filter that's wrapped in paper, and the idea was to cut down on the tar that's drawn in. Now the irony of this is you actually have to breathe in much harder to get the smoke in, so you're actually bringing it deeper into your lungs and presumably causing more damage than if you had a filterless cigarette that was that you were just breathing in lightly with your mouth. And this is what people argue. I don't know if it's true or not. But the interesting thing about all this is about the 50s, they were also beginning to figure out the health implications of smoking, but they didn't tell anyone. They kept it a secret, more or less. And even when charged and asked, is smoking bad for health, they said no, or they had actually been doing studies and lied about it. So, in class, what I'd like us to think about is the legal ramifications of this, because of course nowadays tobacco industry has been sued. A lot of the big companies like William Morris are trying to invest in other things. They still grow tobacco. Of course, they sell it abroad, right? I mean, it's even though American usage is going down. And you may know that we are constantly trying to get people to smoke less and less. You may know in California this past year, the smoking age went up to 21. I don't know if that's going to change anything, but it means that like purchasing alcohol legally, you can't purchase tobacco until you're fully adult, I guess, 21 years old. And that includes vaping, and we can discuss that in class too, because there are people who argue that it's just as dangerous, even if you're not using nicotine in it. It's bringing that stuff into your lungs is causing just as much damage. So we can talk about that, and we can talk about the the legality of it. If it's really a dangerous drug and causes cancer, and the costs of healthcare are being spread around to everyone who's paying their healthcare insurance, well then maybe this is one of those things we could very well make illegal. I don't, some people would get it on the black market. Of course, there'd be, rings of people selling tobacco in the streets like any other drug, but maybe people would use less of it. Has the taxing of it, and it is exorbitantly taxed, has that worked in the end? And let me give you a very good example. Years ago, when I was actually a smoker, I was in Norway, and in Norway they decided that they're going to put an incredible tax on tobacco to make it cost prohibitive. So it cost me, for buying a little packet of rolling tobacco, loose tobacco, it was about $35. And after buying a lighter and papers, it was like 40 something. And I bought it, and there are lots of people in Norway that smoke, and apparently they buy it too, and maybe they smoke less. I don't know, but it certainly didn't prevent it from happening. And you can buy tobacco on any street corner in Oslo. Surprisingly enough, there are 7-Elevens everywhere in Oslo. That's really disappointing, I know, but does a punitive tax really work for vice? It makes money for the government, but does it? It actually takes money out of people's pockets that they might spend on food. I don't know. So these are very interesting things that we can certainly discuss in class. And I'd like you to think, of whether it's really responsible to allow people to use something that is just poisonous. It really is. There's no two ways about it. And then pass those costs on to other people if they get sick. That's you might argue that that's really irresponsible. So we'll talk about it next time. See ya.